February 14, 2025, at Huntsville Prison in Texas, an execution was carried out quietly, but its echoes still reverberate. Richard Lee Tabler, after nearly 20 years on death row, finally stepped into the death chamber where his long, dark journey ended with a lethal injection. In this video, we will uncover what happened, his final meal, and his last words. Richard Lee Tabler was born on February 5, 1979 in California and was executed by lethal injection on February 14, 2025 at the Huntsville unit in Texas at the age of 46. His life was a chain of instability and violence shaped by a deeply troubled childhood. Richard grew up in an unhappy home. His father abandoned him and his mother raised him alone. After his parents divorced, Richard moved constantly, lacking any stability or proper parental guidance. At age 12, he was diagnosed with ADHD. He often caused trouble, stealing, fighting with police, and even once escaping while in handcuffs. In prison, Richard displayed a strangely contrasting side. One day, he found a small lizard in his cell and decided to care for it, naming it Little Blue. He fed it, let it crawl on him, and treated it like a companion. This behavior surprised many guards as it starkly contradicted his violent image. Yet Richard's unstable nature revealed itself in disturbing ways. In 2008, while incarcerated, he used a contraband phone to call and threaten Texas State Senator John Whitmire and his family, which triggered a full lockdown across the prison system. Even after each murder, Richard had a pattern. He would call the police to boast and issue threats showing arrogance and provocation. Near the end of his life, Richard claimed he turned to religion, wrote stories, painted, and mentored fellow inmates. But to the public, his remorse was met with skepticism. Richard's actions weren't impulsive. He meticulously planned his crimes, borrowing a 9M handgun, picking up a camcorder, and securing a pickup truck. He also convinced an 18-year-old named Timothy Payne, someone who looked up to Richard, to join him. Timothy wasn't just an accomplice, he was also the one assigned to record the entire execution on camera. On the night of November 25, while families gathered to celebrate Thanksgiving, Richard began executing his plan. He called Mohammed Amini Ramoni, the manager of a strip club named Teasers, offering a cheap stereo system, no questions asked. Mohammed agreed to meet and brought along his friend Hayam Zed, who drove them to the rendezvous. On 2 p.m., their vehicle pulled into an empty commercial parking lot, Richard's pre-selected location, hidden in the dark. Richard and Timothy waited with their truck lights off. The moment Hayam parked, Richard stepped out of the shadows and opened fire. Hayam was hit first, then Mohammed. But Richard didn't stop. He pulled both men out of the car. When he saw Mohammed was still moving, he shot him again, finishing the job. All the while, Timothy stood nearby, camera in hand, recording everything. Richard rifled through the blood-soaked car, taking a wallet, a black bag, and whatever else he could find of value. He vanished into the night like a ghost. Not long after, he proudly recounted the story to his cellmate, even showing the recording before attempting to destroy it. But that wasn't the most chilling part. Richard then called the sheriff's office. Calmly, he declared, "I killed them." And after a pause, he added, "I'm not done yet." 2 days later, he proved he meant it. Richard Tabler had a list, 11 names, all connected to the Teaser strip club. To him, it wasn't just a list, it was a death sentence. At the top were 2 teenage girls, 18-year-old Tiffany Dodson and 16-year-old Amanda Benfield. On November 28th, Richard lured them out. He likely promised drugs, a party, or just a quick high. Whatever it was, it worked. He drove them to a remote lake area, no lights, no neighbors, no one to hear screams. Once there, just like before, he pulled out the same gun and fired repeatedly until both girls collapsed into silence. According to his later confession, Richard believed Tiffany and Amanda had snitched to police about Mohammed and Hayam's murders. Maybe they did, maybe they didn't. To Richard, the truth didn't matter. Belief alone was justification enough. He cast himself as judge, jury, and executioner. The next day, an Army Corps of Engineers employee stumbled upon their bodies near the lake. Tiffany was quickly identified, but Amanda remained nameless for days. It wasn't until December 14th, more than a week later, that her identity was confirmed. She had run away from home in Louisiana, ended up in the strip club scene, and crossed paths with the wrong man. And Richard wasn't finished. He called the Bell County Sheriff's Office again, not to confess, but to gloat. He admitted to killing Tiffany and Amanda and warned that more deaths would follow if the club wasn't shut down. He threatened not just the club's employees, but police too. anyone who got in his way. This madness, this chilling confidence, this cold-blooded defiance would soon hit its limit. Within 2 weeks, 4 people were dead. Richard Tabler's name became notorious across Bell County and the entire state of Texas. But justice didn't catch up with him immediately. In fact, when Richard was first arrested, it wasn't for murder, it was for felony theft. At that point, police didn't yet grasp the magnitude of what he had done. However, the timing, his demeanor, and the growing suspicions led investigators to dig deeper, and it didn't take long. During interrogation, Richard crumbled. In just a few hours, he confessed to all 4 killings: Muhammad, Hayam, Tiffany, Amanda, every shot, every movement, every plan. He recounted with disturbing precision. He also named Timothy Payne as his accomplice. Police arrested Timothy later that night. Though Timothy never pulled the trigger, his involvement in filming and aiding the crimes made him just as guilty under Texas law. But when trial began, Richard suddenly reversed course. He recanted his confession. He claimed it was coerced, that he had lied under pressure. He denied everything, even the tapes, the testimony, the physical evidence. No one believed him. The confession had been too detailed, too accurate. It was the truth. On November 30th, 2004, less than a week after Tiffany and Amanda were found, Richard and Timothy were formally charged with 2 counts of capital murder for the Thanksgiving night killings. 10 days later, Richard was charged with 2 more counts, this time for the murders of the girls. By then, the death penalty was all but certain. Richard's trial began in March 2007. Every gruesome detail was laid bare: how he planned the killings, how he lured his victims, pulled the trigger, bragged about it, and mocked the justice system. His own words, recorded in phone calls and confessions, sealed his fate. The coldness in his voice, the absence of remorse left the jury stunned. On April 2, 2007, Richard Lee Tabler was sentenced to death. Twice. 1 sentence for each of the men he killed that Thanksgiving night. Prosecutors didn't even pursue the charges for Tiffany and Amanda. They didn't need to. Richard was going to die. Timothy Payne's trial took place in November. Though found guilty, he was spared the death penalty. He hadn't fired the gun, and he was only 18 at the time. Instead, he received life without parole. He remains incarcerated at the Memorial Unit. He won't be eligible for parole until 2044 after serving at least 40 years. For Richard, death row became a long, twisted journey filled with contradictions. One year he said he was ready to die. The next, he filed appeals, blaming his lawyers, blaming mental illness, blaming everything but himself. Motion after motion was denied. Every legal door closed. All that remained was the walk to the death chamber. And then in 2008, Richard made headlines again. If anyone still believed he had changed, that hope was crushed when he used a contraband cell phone from prison to call Texas State Senator John Whitmire, not to plead for mercy, but to threaten his life and the lives of his family. The call triggered a statewide lockdown. Every prison in Texas tightened security. The incident was splashed across newspapers. The public was outraged, and any lingering sympathy for Richard vanished over. Yet in the final years of his life, a different Richard emerged, or so some believed. He started painting, writing, attending religious groups. He claimed he had found God and even tried to mentor younger inmates. Through a prison pen pal program, he met a woman who eventually became his wife. She believed in him wholeheartedly. "The Richard I know isn't the monster they say he is," she wrote. "I've never met anyone, even out here in the free world, with a heart as big as his." His family agreed. His mother and sister described him as soft-spoken, deeply emotional, someone who cared about animals and the vulnerable. One story in particular stood out, about a little lizard named Little Blue. One summer afternoon in 2019, while cleaning his cell, Richard spotted the lizard crawling along the wall. Most inmates might have killed it. Richard fed it, trained it to crawl up his arm, perch on his shoulder, even rest on his head. He named it after himself. His old nickname, Little Blue. Guards watched in awe. They had seen Richard scream, threaten, and lash out, but now he whispered to a lizard, holding it gently like a fragile hope for redemption. But the world outside wasn't convinced. 4 lives had been taken. No repentance, no matter how sincere, could erase that. And so Texas set a date. On February 14, 2025, just 8 days after his 46th birthday, Richard Tabler was led to the execution chamber at Huntsville. Texas had abolished the last meal tradition in 2011 after several inmates abused the privilege. So Richard received a standard prison meal. Nothing more. Before the injection, Richard was allowed to speak. Facing the victims' families, he said in a trembling voice, "There's not a day that goes by that I don't regret what I did. I had no right to take your loved ones away. I pray, hope, and beg that one day you might find it in your hearts to forgive me. I know no apology can bring them back." He thanked his family, his lawyers, the prison staff. Then he turned to the warden and whispered, "I'm done." As the lethal drugs entered his veins, he mouthed, "I'm sorry." His breathing grew shallow. 12 quick breaths. Then stillness. Richard Lee Tabler was pronounced dead at 6:38 p.m. He was 46 years old. A dark, blood-soaked circle had closed, haunting, complicated, and final.